to participate. Let's talk about what went down and what we can take from it with former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt, who also ran for the leadership in 2017. Michelle Caudario has prepared former Prime Ministers Paul Martin and former BC Premier Christy Clark for leadership debates. She was previously Prime Minister Martin's Deputy Chief of Staff. And former NDP President Brian Topp ran for the leadership in 2012. Hello to all three of you. Wonderful to see you this evening. Lisa, I'm going to start with you. If you had to write a headline for last night's debate, what would it be?
Expect the unexpected.
That's one way to put it.
Not what I expected. Not what I expected at all, Vashi. I actually didn't watch it live. I thought I'd just pick it up later on YouTube. And when I started watching it, I was riveted because right out of the gates, when Mr. Charay wouldn't shake Mr. Poilievre's hand and Mr. Poilievre didn't look at Mr. Charay, I thought, this is not the kind of race that I went through. This was not how it appeared backstage at the last race. So this is a very unique situation. And surely enough, it played itself out exactly like that. A lot of tenseness.
Yeah. And I wonder, Michelle, because I think in the lead up to it, we see on social media the back and forth in particular between Mr. Charay and Mr. Poilievre. But sometimes that doesn't always materialize in person in politics, right? Like when you're there in the room, it can be more civil. It's not necessarily as, the language is different than is used on social media. But it was pretty close to what we've been seeing in the lead up to this. Why do you think that is? And what impression do you think that left?
Well, no doubt that was nasty. And it was surprising because especially when you're having like an internal debate of leadership candidates amongst one party, there's always the consensus generally that candidates know they have to come together at the end somehow because there's actually another opponent out there that they want to beat even more than the people who are standing with them on the stage. Like that there's some kind of a collegiality at least underlying it. But boy, that was missing completely last night. And they were just sparring toe to toe. And I think that they forgot that, other Canadians who aren't necessarily, who aren't partisan conservatives might have been watching. And I'm not sure that they would have gotten a great taste in their mouth. They certainly wouldn't have known that perhaps their biggest opponent was Justin Trudeau in the next election campaign.
Brian, do you think that is reflective of the fact that there are some major ideological differences between the candidates?
I think what there is a big gap in judgment. Look, I think the headline of that debate was "Conservatives hope that nobody watched it." And what we look, the front runner in that race appears to be Pierre Poilievre. He is the person who's being tested here. Usually, what a federal party thinks that a 3-term Quebec premier would be a pretty good get. And what the front runner in the Tory race did in the face of a potentially very key and helpful ally is vilify him to the whole debate. And in this, he missed an opportunity to be the bigger person and to say, Jean, you took me on over an issue that we fundamentally disagree on. But when this is over, let's work together and let's build a big conservative team that's going to win in Quebec and win in the rest of the country. And instead, what he did was vilify a 3-term Quebec premier. And what that tells you is, though he says he's running for prime minister, what he's running for is today's Conservative Party. And he is aiming at, the darker corners of that party, using populist rhetoric of the kind we see quite a bit south of the border. And I think, frankly, Patrick Brown had the right idea. The best move was not to be there. I think Canadians got to look at a pretty troubling look at the front runner in this race.
Lisa, I'll get you to jump off that because I guess the only caveat I would add is it's not like Mr. Charay was using flowery language about Mr. Poilievre in this debate either. They were certainly both very I take Brian's point, but they were like you said, Mr. Charay didn't want to shake his hand even.
Mm-hmm. Look, for me, I expected that. I expected both of those candidates to come out and swing because, quite frankly, I think Conservatives figured out that Mr. Nice Guy isn't seeming to be working when it comes to going up against the Liberals, being Mr. O'Toole and Mr. Scheer. So they are looking for somebody who's going to be a bit more pugnacious. But the shock of the night and the unexpected part, Vashi, was Leslyn Lewis turning to Mr. Pierre Poilievre and saying the things that she said, like, take a position, take a stand, you're avoiding the question. I don't know whether or not Mr. Poilievre and his team expected or anticipated that, but she landed a really good punch, I thought. And I thought that was a really interesting way for her to come out in her first debate, because we did not see that last time.
No, I was going to say it's definitely a pivot from what she was projecting in the last leadership race, and it was certainly focused, for example, Michelle, on his Mr. Poilievre's position when it comes to abortion, really, and asking him to clarify his own personal views on it, which was an issue for Mr. Scheer, for example, in the general election that he ran in. As you take a step back and look at the way this debate unfolded, we are just a few days away from the official one that takes place in Edmonton next week, Michelle. If you were giving some advice to, let's say, Pierre Poilievre, what would it be going into that debate?
I think what I would say to him is that he's got to take the heat out of his answers. He is the front runner, and he wants people to look at him as the alternative to Justin Trudeau, and somebody who is taking nasty shots and talking over somebody and repeating a question over and over and over again about Huawei to Mr. Charay. That's not. I'm not sure that that's actually what he wants to project if he's trying to say that he's going to be the next prime minister. And so I think that he should watch the tape, is what I would advise him, and take some breathing exercises. And cool down. And I also think that to Lisa's point about bringing up the core question, he's got to have sharp answers. He's got to be ready for those questions that come up election after election after election, and too often trip up the Conservative leaders.
Brian, on Ms. Lewis putting Mr. Poilievre kind of on the spot, and just more generally the attitudes of other candidates towards Mr. Poilievre. Would your advice to them going into the next debate be keep at it, or would you advise a different approach?
Yeah, let's also remember they were debating who had the strongest embrace of lawbreakers, and so my advice to them is think carefully before you break your party. But to your question, you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, he has to decide where he stands on the top issues that are before you, and he is not running as a challenger here like many of these other candidates are. He's the front runner. He's saying, I'm running for prime minister. He's tried to jump past this leadership race and say, I'm debating Justin Trudeau. And what we saw in that debate last night was not somebody who's ready to be prime minister. He's auditioning to be an opposition leader in a populist right, far right party. And so he's got a little time now to think about whether that's what he's going to do. As to his challengers, they're right to take on the front runner. And I just think they have to consider whether they're staking out positions that most Canadians won't support.
Lisa, I'll give the final word to you. Just about 30 seconds left. What are you watching for in the next debate after what you witnessed last night?
One thing I did want to mention that I also witnessed, and what I want to see carried out between now and the next debate, is the fact that one of the complaints against Mr. Charay was that he was too old and that he was yesterday's guy. He came out pretty spirited last night, and he spoke with a lot of understanding of where we are now and where we came from as a party. And let's see if that kind of enthusiasm and that kind of energy keeps going into the next election, into the next debate. And I completely agree. Everyone should go home and watch their own tape and figure out what happened.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Really appreciate the discussion this evening. Thanks so much to Lisa Raitt, Michelle Cadario, and Brian Topp. The 6 candidates vying to become Conservative. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.